Good evening, ladies and gents. My name is Zenonagi, and I'll be your host as we take a look at some of the stranger things of this world. On the chopping block tonight is a story of one of the strongest and most primal of urges, hunger. In a moment, I'm going to tell you two tales, one of a man, and the other of a monster. The year is 1770. The world is a very different place than what we would recognize today. There was much political and economic dismay throughout Europe, but right now our focus is in a small rural community in east-central France, near the city of Lyon. Here lives a lower-class family who are about to bring a baby into this world. A baby boy whose exact birth date and exact birth name were never recorded, but throughout his life this boy would come to be called Tarrare. Tarrare did not grow up in the greatest of conditions. His family struggled to afford enough food for Tarrare to eat, and it wasn't uncommon for him to go to bed hungry. Eventually, when Tarrare was in his early teens, he was forced to leave home when his parents could no longer afford to keep him fed. Now living as a beggar, Tarrare would wander the streets with no sense of home, eating whatever scraps he could manage to salvage, and eventually resorted to stealing in order to keep himself fed. Having no real skills to get himself a finer job, Tarrare finally found luck in working with traveling charlatans and street performers. Finally, he was earning himself an honest living. A few years later, in 1792, the War of the First Coalition broke out, and Tarrare ended up joining the French Revolutionary Army. This new line of work was not a kind one, and again Tarrare found himself hungry and exhausted where food rations were short. After months of work in the service, Tarrare was assigned as a military courier, where his job would be to transport documents and messages across enemy lines, using his skills he learned as a street performer to avoid being caught. One night, however, he was caught and captured at the hands of the Prussian authorities. Tarrare was imprisoned, beaten, and very nearly executed before being released back into French lines at the mercy of his captors. It was from this point on that Tarrare wanted nothing further to do with the military. Tarrare had trouble finding suitable work after this, and eventually became physically unwell. Hospitalized, doctors struggled to discover what was wrong with him. Many cures were attempted, but nothing would ease his plight. Some speculated Tarrare to also be mentally ill, but before being transferred to an asylum, Tarrare was forced out of the hospital and back onto the streets. 4 more years passed in what must have been the darkest time of Tarrare's life. Until 1798 he was hospitalized once more, this time with tuberculosis. It wasn't long until Tarrare finally passed away at the age of only 26. What you've just heard was the story of a man, one who struggled with life like many others of his time did. However, this is far from the whole story, for you see, Tarrare was seldom described as an ordinary man. He was more often described as a monster. Tarrare didn't grow up hungry because food was too scarce. He was hungry because he carried with him an insatiable appetite, one that would never cease. As a child, he would almost eat his weight in beef daily, much more than his parents could afford. On the streets, Tarrare ate trash right out of the gutter, and any small animals he could get his hands on. And it was this bizarre talent that earned him a job as a street performer. People would line up to watch as Tarrare devoured baskets full of apples, live animals such as cats and snakes and eels, even inanimate objects such as rocks and corks. The ordinary amount of food a person consumes in a day is maybe about 5 pounds, while competitive eating typically involves an upward limit of about 6 to 8 pounds. Most world records reach around 10 pounds. One of Tarrare's records involved consuming a whopping 30 pounds of raw bull lung and liver in a single sitting. That's 3 times more than what should be humanly possible. When fully gorged, his stomach would distend like an inflated balloon. But despite his diet, Tarrare never gained any weight, remaining a slim 100 pounds for most of his adult life. But those weren't his only bizarre features. Tarrare's mouth was described as abnormally wide, almost double the usual size, with an almost non-existent set of lips and a set of heavily stained teeth. For as lean as he was, his skin hung very loosely from his body. His wrinkled and saggy cheeks could hold up to 12 eggs or apples in his mouth at once, and one could even wrap the fold of skin from his abdomen around his waist like a belt. If that wasn't enough, Tarrare's skin was also very flushed and sweaty, constantly hot to the touch, and gave off an incredibly foul odor that only worsened after his meals. After eating, his eyes and face would become bloodshot, his body heat would increase. Some reported that he got so hot his sweat would visibly turn into steam. And after eating, he was known to emit many peculiar groans and gurgles as he would settle into lethargy. His mental state was also something to question. Beyond his insatiable hunger, Tarrare was reported as being apathetic of nearly all things, displaying little other emotions or ideas beyond his desire to eat. Furthermore, he showed no sympathy or conscience for the things he ate, pet or livestock, dead or alive. He had no compassion. He was a predator. During his time in the military, the limits of his appetite were tested when he was presented with a live cat. He tore into the cat's abdomen with his teeth and drank its blood, proceeded to eat the entire animal aside from its bones, before vomiting up its fur and skin some time later. But this was far from the worst that came from Tarrare's hunger. While he was hospitalized following the war, Tarrare would sneak about and drink the blood from patients who were undergoing bloodletting, was even caught attempting to steal human remains from the hospital mortuary. But it wasn't until a 14-month-old child went missing in the hospital that everyone had enough of Tarrare's antics and chased him out by force. When he finally received an autopsy after his death years later, doctors were baffled at what they found. His throat and gullet were so abnormally wide that one could see straight down into his stomach while his mouth was opened. His liver and gallbladder were abnormally large, with an enormous ulcer-filled stomach that took up most of his abdomen. Most of the rest of his body contained pus and was noted to decay at an incredibly fast rate, filling the air with a sickening and putrid stench. Never before had doctors seen a patient so seemingly inhuman. But how long was it until they saw another one after him? Contemporary Charles Domery, born in Binch, Poland in around 1778, only 6 years after Tarrare, and 650 miles away. Domery was a voracious eater very similar to Tarrare, consuming vast amounts of food and sweating very profusely as he slept. Unlike the only child Tarrare, Charles was one of 9 brothers, all of whom were said to have a similar appetite, but only Charles in particular went down in history. Domery's massive diet included 10 times a normal man's rations, live cats, rats, candles, 16 pounds of raw cow udder, various medicines meant for different sick people, 4 to 5 pounds of grass if he could find no other food, and in one instance, Charles tried to devour the leg of one of his crewmates that had been severed by some cannon fire. He had to be wrestled into submission by multiple others just to prevent him from eating it. Speaking of crew members, Domery was also a soldier in the War of the First Coalition like Tarrare was, but instead fighting for the Prussian side against the French. That is, until he later switched sides because the small rations provided by the Prussians did not satisfy him. It was then in 1798 that Domery and his crew were captured in Liverpool, where he was experimented on by British doctors. His ultimate fate after this point is left unknown. Now, of course, there have been many attempts to explain these men's conditions, that they may have been nothing more than victims of simple eating disorders. It's been put forward that they suffered from hyperthyroidism, which can induce extreme appetite, rapid weight loss, profuse sweating, and heat intolerance, all traits they managed to demonstrate. More recently, it was speculated that their appetites may have instead stemmed from a damaged amygdala in the brain, which would result in a constant hunger. But if it was that easy to explain with modern diseases, why don't we see more cases of such severity? It's worth noting that the medical field at the time and the place was very different than what we have today. It would not be unheard of that the reports and diagnosis given to Tarrare and Domery may have been exaggerated to inhuman levels, or perhaps even straight-up fabrications. In the same vein, records regarding the birth dates and locations of these two is spotty. Domery's birthplace city of Bench has no record of even existing in Poland at all. But what I find most interesting is the location in which these cases happened. Europe is no stranger to tales of myth and folklore, and it should come as no surprise that France and the surrounding area has its own unique brand of folklore. It is here where we see legends of ogres, large mythical beings with insatiable appetites who dined on human flesh, particularly human infants. Leads one to wonder if there was any basis to these myths, if ancient villagers who were telling the tales were actually seeing real people with great appetites, maybe ancestors of the above individuals. Perhaps Tarrare and Domery were very recent accounts of such mythical creatures existing, or, inversely, it could have been the legends of ogres that led to the fabrication of Tarrare and Domery's tales. Maybe neither of them were real. Maybe only one of them was real, and the other made up to capitalize on the fame of the first. Maybe there were many others like them who did not have the fortune of being remembered in history. Maybe more people like this exist among us to this day. In the end, Tarrare and Domery were very mysterious individuals, and it seems history will never know the full true story of them. I'll leave it up to you guys to decide if they were more man, myth, or monster.